On behalf of the Integrated Academic Society of Clinical Oncology, I welcome all of you to the online certificate training course for members of Ethics Committee and related personnel. This is on the basis of what is required by the ICMR National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical and Human Research and GCP, Good Clinical Practices. And at the end, all those who are participating can take part in the MCQ, final MCQ, to be eligible for the certificate. The baseline MCQ link has already been shared with all of you, and I hope that you have already, put in your answers so that you understand what questions and what are the important points in this MCQ. Now, this is the agenda for today. We have 8 topics. The last one is, of course, the moderation with question and answers. So without wasting much time, let me start by introducing the first speaker, Dr. Pankaj Kumar Panda. He is Senior Research Officer from the National Cancer Center in Singapore.
Sir, we're still on your
He is
first slide,
also
sir.
member of the Scientific Clinical Trials Committee, Head and Neck Cancer, and is also the editor of BMC Cancer. He is Associate Editor of South Asian Journal of Cancer, and we have been associated together on a lot of academic activities before he moved to Singapore. So now with this introduction, I hand over to Dr. Pankaj for his first session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's always been a pleasure to be associated with you for all the academic activities. So let me share my screen. I hope my screen is visible to everyone.
Yeah, we can see your slides.
Thank you. So, good afternoon. It's evening for me here. So, and thank you all for joining in for the session. I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful session for all of you. So, I've been given the task of like a brief introduction and overview of clinical trials because, well, that's what we are for here, like clinical trials or clinical research. So, I'll take you through a little bit about what exactly are trials, research, and how are they very distinctively related to clinical practice. So these are my disclosures and disclaimer. So we all here, like being clinicians and being in the field of healthcare, we hear these two words almost every day, which is research and practice. And somewhere down the line, we do know that both are different, but are they different? Uh, so basically, the kind of like a very simplified definition of clinical practice is intervention designed solely to enhance the well-being of the patient and that have a reasonable expectation of success, while clinical research is mean as an activity designed to test a hypothesis, permit conclusions to be drawn, develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Now, coming down to a little bit more in detail, what exactly is clinical research? By definition, it's quite a long, lengthy definition, but by definition, as by the National Institutes of Health, it's a patient oriented research. Research is conducted with human subjects, with patients, or their tissue, the specimen, for which an investigator, as in you all, or a colleague, directly interacts with these human beings or patients or subjects. And excluded from these definitions are the in vitro studies. I mean, like what we can say is the basic lab studies or the basic science studies. These are excluded from this. And patient oriented research also includes mechanisms of human disease like disease progression or other things, therapeutic interventions like new surgical techniques or newer chemotherapeutic agents, immunotherapeutic agents, newer radiation therapy techniques, clinical studies, or even epidemiology and behavioral studies just to see the prevalence and the incidence of certain diseases, and outcomes research and health services research also, which may include quality of life or the daily living aspect, the economical aspect of disease burden. So all these things will come under clinical research, which is a very broad term. But then again, I'll also come in a little while, like how is it different from clinical trial? Is clinical research exactly different from clinical trial or are they same? So now coming to what constitutes good clinical research. To begin with, it always begins with a research question. We all have questions in our mind, and lots of questions because we interact with patients on a day-to-day basis. We see a lot of patients, we see their condition, we see their progression, we see their treatment responses, but we have lots of questions. So it begins with a research question. However, the research question should be pragmatic, relevant, and high value. And not all research questions will proceed to a clinical trial stage. It always has to be refined through proper literature search, talking to your colleagues, peers, mentors, seniors. And then after a lot of scrutiny, then we realize, okay, this research question is pertinent and has to be answered. There is benefit in answering this research question. So then we conduct a clinical trial, we design a study, we conduct it, we analyze the data, and then we publish it. And the trial outcome out of the clinical trial has to be useful, implementable, and potential to be the next standard of care. So here begins the journey of good clinical research. It all begins with a good idea. As I mentioned, we do a lot of thorough literature search, talk to our peers, mentors, seniors, colleagues, and then we finalize a study design so as to see how our idea can be turned into a good research question, and then again into a proper, suitably designed study, which is suitably powered with good sample size, which can be achievable. Also, we must think of the ethical aspect of a study in terms of, because whatever we are doing, the center of everything is our patients. So it has to be ethical from a patient perspective, and it has to protect the interests of all patients who are going to be a part of this study. And then we conduct the study, analyze the data, and we then publish it. So what constitutes a good research idea? Why I'm focusing a little bit more on the idea is because it all begins with the idea. It has to be feasible, interesting to investigator, peer clinicians. It has to be novel because there is no point in doing a research or a study which has already been done that will add to lot of wastage of resources, manpower, time. So it's always important to see how novel is our study, what new it is adding to the already available literature, what new it is adding to the medical community, and what extra benefit are we going to give it to our patients. And definitely ethical, which is good clinical practice, which I'm sure in the subsequent lectures today you're going to learn a lot about what exactly are ethical clinical practices or good clinical practices, and what are the guidelines which will help you to learn all this. And definitely it has to be relevant. We can't work on a study which is outdated or almost going to be outdated. And these kind of knowledge or ideas we get when we talk a lot or read a lot about the current literature or keep a tab on the current researches which is happening all across the world. So now coming to clinical trial, which is the other term which we heard. And as I mentioned, clinical trial is also defined by NIH as a research study which includes human subjects and are prospectively assigned to one or more intervention, and to evaluate the effects of these interventions on health related outcomes. So they can be of various types, can be treatment trials where we are testing the various types of treatments, such as some chemotherapeutic agent, immunotherapeutic agent, or a newer surgical intervention. So these are treatment trials. There have been prevention trials also, where we test the efficacy or the usefulness of a particular agent or an intervention to see whether this thing can prevent disease occurrence or can prevent the progression of a disease, or similar. And also nowadays, quality of life trials have become very important because, as we know, it's not only about the treatment, but the quality of treatment is important, the quality of life, the cure, but not the quality of cure is important. We may do aggressive treatment of a patient, but and the patient might be cured, but at what cost? If the patient is not able to lead a good quality of life after the treatment, then the treatment is not actually beneficial for the patient. So there are quality of life studies also, where we see after we give a particular intervention whether the patient's quality of life has improved or not. Then there are diagnostic trials also, where various diagnostic modalities, imaging or dyes or any other techniques of biopsy are used to see how well we can diagnose cancer or with what accuracy. There are various study designs which I'm not going to go into the detail because that will take a lot of time. So just for a snapshot, there can be observational or experimental. Observational definitely means that we are not doing any active intervention. They can be descriptive or analytical, where we have in the routine practice, we have treated a patient and we see some interesting results that can be published as a case report or a case series. There are analytical studies which can be cross-sectional, case control study, cohort studies, which are done usually in the community or in a larger cohort of people. And then come the more conventional, the experimental studies where we do either a randomized control trial, which where we are comparing two interventions or treatment modalities. And there can be a non-randomized control trial also, which is a single arm study where we are prospectively following up a cohort of patients after an intervention. Now, these are also some of the terms which you have heard and you will be coming across during the subsequent stages of your research practice or research career, which is usually in terms of a drug development. There are two big phases, which is the preclinical phase and then the clinical phase. The clinical phase is more or less used with the drug discovery phase, I would say, where a new drug molecule is discovered. So that molecule has to be tested for its biochemical properties, then other aspects, so as to find uh, what are the molecular characteristics of the drug, how well it is going to be useful to the human patients when it is tested in human beings. So these are all preclinical, which is before we test it on human beings. So usually it is done in laboratory in on animals, and that is how we at least have an idea about what is the chemical structure, how it is potentially going to behave. Now then comes the clinical phase of studies, which we call as the phase 1, 2, or 3, and 4. Phase 1 is basically when we are trying to find out the best possible dose for the intervention or the drug. And in the phase one study, we usually try to find out the maximum tolerable dose, because whatever dosage we have an idea, it is all tested on animals. So we have to we start with a very low dose and then we see what is the maximum tolerable dose to the patient, and then that dose will help us to go to the next level of drug development, which is the phase 2. And we test it on a little more number of patients and to see what the drug does to the body, what the body does to the drug. The pharmacokinetics of the drug are evaluated in these phases. And then once the molecule or the drug has had a positive result in the phase 2 and we see that yes, it is beneficial, we go to the next stage, which is the phase 3 stage, where we do it on a larger group of patients to see how the drug is behaving in a larger group of patients. And then after phase 3, when the phase 3 study is completed, we submit the results to the regulatory authorities for the drug approval. So after the approval, all is not finished. There is a phase 4 also, because all these phases which I've mentioned, be it even the preclinical or phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3, these are done on patients who are tightly regulated in a very tightly regulated environment under hospital circumstances where everything is under control. But however, if a drug is out in the market, we do not have that much control. But then also it is important to see how the drug is behaving in the open market, like in the general population, whichever patient is taking. So that is phase 4. So phase 4 is also very important to see the efficacy of a drug in the general population where it is required. And some of the other big differences in terms of ethics, I would say, is that except for oncology and psychiatry drugs, phase 1 studies are usually done on the healthy volunteers. For oncology and psychiatry drugs, it is usually done under patients, while the phase 2, 3, 4 obviously are done for patients usually. So these are some of the regulatory requirements which will be governing clinical trials in India, which I'm sure are going to be covered by our wonderful speakers in the coming lectures subsequently. And a little bit of a snapshot about what usually is required for a study submission to the IRB, like the basic trial protocol, the patient information and informed consent, investigator brochure if applicable, investigator's CV, good clinical practice certificate, which you are going to obtain at the end of this lecture or this lecture series. And it is mandatory for all ethics committees ask for a GCP certificate for investigators. Not only the PI, but even the co-investigators have to have a GCP certificate. And without that, they're not going to take the study for like consideration or approval or anything or review. So these are, and nowadays the AV recording also, I'm sure it's going to be covered. Like there are guidelines for AV recording when usually the drug is a sponsored study or under industry sponsored or like which involves drugs which are regulated by the DCGI. So now, once we have heard about clinical research and clinical trials, so we can tell the difference between both. So as you can see in the images, clinical research includes all like preclinical, animal studies, everything it includes, while clinical trial is usually the one which involves human beings, as I mentioned, human subjects. So before we start, there is nothing to panic. Please plan effectively. Most important is to have a very clear research question. Seek statistical advice right at the beginning, even before you go to the ethics committee or anywhere, or you write even the protocol. And use the right study design, not to be very ambitious and have a huge sample size where, and then we are lost that we are not able to accrue the right number of patients. And act ethically. We all are working for our patients, so that has to be the most important factor whenever we are doing any activity related to clinical research. Keep an open mind, be open to ideas, be open to criticisms, constructive criticisms, and talk to your peers and minimize bias. There are lots of methods of minimizing that. And right at the beginning, agree who will be the principal investigator, the authors, the contributors. And these are some of the factors which are integral to the core ethics of conducting clinical research. So that's why I've mentioned all these things. And don't be afraid of negative results. Like sometimes this notion that negative results might be detrimental, might not be published, it's kind of leads to some like other activities, but never be afraid of publishing negative results because that is even useful for the scientific community. So this was my overview, and I would like thank you. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Pankaj. We now move to the second talk, and that is on the roles and responsibilities of the ethics committee. So I'm going to invite Dr. Aparna Parikh to give this talk. She is Executive Director, Scientific Affairs and Country Consultant for India for the second largest CRO in the world, that is ICON PLC. She is a pediatrician and clinical research professional with more than 23 years of experience. And she has got a significant amount of global clinical trial experience, regulatory support, and she is also a scientific member of the ICMR Ethics Committee. So clearly, she knows exactly what are the roles and responsibilities, and she will share that with you. Over to you, Dr. Aparna.
Thank you, Dr. Parikh. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. So I will move on to the roles and responsibilities of EC members. Just to mention, this is the legal framework for conduct of clinical trials in India, and that includes the NDCT, or the New Drugs and Clinical Trials Rules 2019. It also includes the ICMR ethical guidelines for biomedical and health research involving human participants. And in case of pediatric clinical trials, then it also involves the ICMR pediatric guidelines. The next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just the genesis of ethical dilemma, and we've all heard about the media report on human rights abuse, and this has aroused a significant amount of public distrust, endangering all future clinical research. And this has further been aggravated in the past by negative reports in media. But since the COVID pandemic, there has been an advantage because people now have heard about clinical research and the advantages that it could have on your medicines and vaccines. And we also have desperate patients who seek unproven remedies. So with that, can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, so what is the difference between, why do we need an ethics committee? What's the difference between goals for clinical practice and clinical research? Dr. Panda also mentioned about it. So in clinical practice, we want to provide the best treatment to the individual patient, whereas in clinical research, we want to advance the overall generalized knowledge of medicine so that there is a potential benefit to future patients. Next slide, please. So the ethical principles that need to be applied are basically respect for persons, beneficence and non-maleficence, and justice. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as far as respect for person is concerned, we need informed consent, which is very much required before we start any procedures related to the clinical study. Next slide, please. As far as beneficence and non-maleficence are concerned, there are two general complementary rules: do no harm and maximize the possible benefits and minimize possible harms. So for this, protocol design and the study intervention science are very important. And we need to review this as part of the scientific committee, not the ethics committee though. The justice, this requires us to treat all persons fairly. And for that, we need to look at particularly vulnerable populations. So the vulnerability of subjects or patients is very important. Next slide, please. So why is it needed? It is the ethics committee is needed to protect the study subjects' well-being, rights, confidentiality. And for this, we need to meet the mandate of the Declaration of Helsinki, ICMR GCP guidelines, and to make clinical research which is socially acceptable, acceptable to the regulatory authorities, and publishable by journal editors. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by an ethics committee? We have two types of ethics committees: the independent ethics committee and the institutional review board, or the IRB. And in some cases, the institutional review board is also the institutional ethics committee, not to be confused with the independent ethics committee. And at the same time, not to be confused with a research committee or a scientific review committee, which some of the sites or hospitals have, and the grants committee, which are different from the ethics committee. Next slide, please. So ethics committee is basically an independent body. It is a group of people formally designated to review and approve the initiation of a clinical research study that involves human participants and to provide continuing review of the research study. So this means that the research must conform to recognized ethics and ethical guidelines that includes the protection of the dignity, rights, safety, and well-being of the human participants involved in clinical research. It is constituted of medical, scientific and non-scientific members, and whose responsibility, as I stated above, and we must pay special attention to trials involving vulnerable population. Next slide, please. So under the new drugs and clinical trials rules 2019, there are two types of ethics committees defined, one for clinical trials and BAB studies and the other for biomedical and health research. They are usually established by a government or an institutional authority, hospital or a research institution or a university. ECs may also be set up by private organizations as independent ethics committees, but EC registration is important. This has to be done with the CDSCO. And with the new guidelines, there has been significant increased empowerment of these ethics committees. The registration of the ethics committees has been increased from 3 years to 5 years. And the DCGI must be informed about the approval granted by the ethics committee within 15 working days of the grant of such approval. So the setup, the legal status, and the operation of ECs vary in different countries. We do not have a central ethics committee that some of the countries have. Next slide, please. So the independence of the ethics committee, it must be independent from sponsors, funding agencies, investigators, and any kind of undue influence, whether it's political, institutional, professional, or commercial. This ensures that the interest of the research participants is maintained. And EC members who have any kind of conflict of interest may not be able to participate in decisions concerning a specific protocol. For example, if the investigator participating in the study is being reviewed by the ethics committee, then the ethics committee member is not allowed to be part of the voting for the study as well as the discussions involving the study. Next slide, please. So EC is typically composed of members who have the qualifications and experience to ensure the review of the ethical, scientific, medical, and financial aspects of the study, approve the initiation, and conduct periodic review. They are from diverse professional and personal backgrounds. They must follow the provisions of the NDCT rules, GCP guidelines, and all other regulatory requirements. And every member must undergo training and development programs as required by the CDSCO. Next slide, please. So we have, as per NDCT, a minimum 7 members. The chairperson must be outside the institution, the member secretary, and the multidisciplinary team of 1 to 2 basic medical scientists, 1 to 2 clinicians, a legal expert or a retired judge, a social scientist, or someone from the NGO, or a philosopher, a layperson from the community, and at least 1 woman member. Next slide, please. The external members should be in a majority to ensure independence of the committee, and outside experts may be invited on a specific project, but they are not allowed. They do not have voting rights, and they can have 1 or more subcommittees to assist in these functions. Next slide, please. So EC registration, as I mentioned, registration is very important. The ethics committee must be registered, and this period of 5 years is from the time of the date of the issue by the CDSCO, and unless it is suspended or cancelled. And the renewal must be applied 90 days prior to the date, could be suspended or the registration cancelled. Next slide, please. Okay. So the responsibilities in a nutshell are before the start of research, review and give decision, while the research is in progress, and after completion of research. Next slide, please. So the responsibilities I already mentioned. What we need to review is the study protocol and amendments in the local social and cultural context, and ensure respect for sensitivities and the values of the participants and communities at collaborative sites, check the suitability of the investigator facilities and the methods and material to be used in obtaining and documenting the informed consent. And we still do require audio video recording of the informed consent process in case of vulnerable populations. So the EC needs to ensure this as well. Next slide, please. So the EC SOPs must be in place, the trial registration, the regulatory approval, and it is important that the protocol is reviewed and accorded approval within reasonable time limits. And the decision must be made in a formal meeting and documented. And the approval must be issued in a required format. Record keeping, including meeting agenda, meeting minutes, the decisions, and all of that must be communicated to the investigator. And the annual and final study report must also be reviewed by the ethics committee. Next slide, please. No study enrollment must be done before the EC approval in writing, and any change in membership needs to be intimated in writing to the CDSCO within 30 working days. The EC needs to be impartial and make decisions at announced meetings with a quorum. Investigators and sponsors should have a fair opportunity to be heard, although they cannot participate in the discussions and decision-making process. And the decision must be communicated in writing to the applicant and the relevant authorities. And all the documents must be stored and made available readily for any inspections, and the SOPs also must be stored and archived. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the roles during the study: oversee the conduct of the clinical trial, ongoing review of the clinical trial for which it has approved, any reasons in case it has been rejected or it's asking for a change, and in case of any serious adverse event, to analyze the relevant documents pertaining to such events and forward the report to the CDSCO. Next slide, please. Discontinuation or suspension of the clinical trial can be done by the EC in case of any safety issues or any violations. Any inspections will be allowed by the EC, and they also must be ready to present such a case or inspect the premises with or without any prior notice, and comply with all the requirements or conditions by the CDSCO to safeguard definitely the rights of the clinical trial subject. Next slide, please. Maintenance of the records is very important, and this must be done for the CVs of all EC members. The standard operating procedures, the guidelines must be followed. Copies of all the protocol, the ICF, the CRFs, the investigator brochures, etc., which are submitted for review, must be maintained, and all correspondence to be maintained, agenda, copies of decisions communicated, the records relating to any order related to an early termination of the study and the reasons thereof, the final report of the study, the recommendation given by EC for determination of compensation in case of any serious adverse events, and the records related to these. All of these must be maintained by the EC. Next slide, please. So the EC must function according to the written SOPs, all correspondence with the investigators, the records of the meetings, and all of these must be provided for any audit or inspection, either internal or external. And the study documents should be preserved for at least 3 years after closure, whether it is completed or there is an early termination. Next slide, please. So now let's look at some of the practical problems. What if the PI is also a member of the IEC? In that case, she cannot vote or provide an opinion on trial-related matters. However, any queries that are raised by the ethics committee can be answered, and the concerned person must leave the room when the discussion and the voting is taking place. Next slide, please. Absence of a member, that may result in the committee's bona fides being rejected. So what is the solution? You have an alternate member. Next slide, please. So can a member attend remotely? No, that is not possible. So it was permitted during the pandemic when ethics committees did review study protocols remotely, but that is not allowed now once the pandemic has ended. Next slide, please. So the alternate, next slide, please. You can have alternate members, yes, but only if the SOP provides for them, and they must be named and listed initially, not just selected ad hoc, and they must have CVs similar to the CV of the member that they are alternating for, and they must participate fully in the review of the documents, discussion, and decision. This often happens with a legal member not being available for a particular meeting, and so you must have alternate members with similar CVs and qualifications to review the protocol. Next slide, please. So can an IEC invite ad hoc subject experts for a meeting? Yes, they can invite. They are named, their participation is justified in writing, and their opinion is recorded. For example, if there is a pediatric study and the EC does not have a pediatrician, then a pediatric expert can be invited for the meeting, and they can offer their expert advice or opinion on a scientific or legal issue or even an ethical issue, but they cannot vote for the proposal. Next slide, please. The EC must scrutinize the suitability of the investigator in terms of the qualifications, the experience, the time, the supporting staff available, as well as the facilities and infrastructure at the site, and must also scrutinize the suitability of the protocol for the site, scientific efficiency, as well as the justification of risks versus benefits. Next slide, please. So the typical documents Dr. Panda already mentioned are the protocol, the investigator brochure if available, but the patient information sheet and the informed consent form, the translations and all updates, any written information which is going to be provided to the study participants must be reviewed carefully. All available safety data, information about payments and compensation to the subjects, the subject recruitment procedures, advertisements to recruit subjects, as well as review of any or the ongoing trial at least once a year. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. I'm unable to see the next slide.
And the slides are moving.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
slides are moving, but I can't see them. Okay. So
You can sum up.
yeah, I will sum up in a minute. So if the PI is not if there is more information required, then who answers this information? It's the PI, not the sponsor, and then sponsor can help the investigator respond to the issues. Coming to the next question, does the EC have the authority to look at science? Yes. And should the EC do this? No, because that responsibility is with the scientific review committee. Next slide, next slide. Yeah. Okay, so this is regarding more information. They can ask for more information related for themselves as well as for trial subjects. And this would be to understand and improve the protection of the rights, safety, and well-being of the subjects. Next slide, please. Yeah, so it is not the PI, it's the PI who will provide this information, and the sponsor will help the investigator with this information that regarding any queries that have been raised by the ethics committee and provide any additional information. Yeah, next slide, please. I will sum up in a minute. Yeah.
Ma'am, we're not able to hear you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aparna. We now move on to the next presentation, which is about good clinical practices. And for that, Dr. Tanvi Sood will be there. She is a consultant medical oncologist from Paras Health Gurugram, and she has a large number of honors and awards. The most important one is that she is a Howard certified precision oncologist. So with that, I hand over to Dr. Tanvi Sood, who has been doing a lot of work on clinical trials, even during the COVID times. Over to you, Dr. Tanvi.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. It's always a privilege to be associated. I'll just share my screen. I hope my screen is visible now.
Yes, ma'am, it's visible. Can you make it full screen, please? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I've been given the opportunity to go through an overview of the good clinical practice, and Dr. Pankaj, our first speaker, has actually set a great premise to begin my talk as well. He highlighted on clinical research and good clinical practice. So this comes from the ICH guidelines, and if we have to get into the definition of it, it is defined as standards for the design, conduct, performance, monitoring, auditing, recording, and analysis, as well as the reporting of the clinical trials that provides assurance that the data and reported results are credible and accurate, and also very importantly that the rights and integrity and confidentiality of trial subjects are protected. So, just to give a little bit of historical perspective on human research conduct and where this even originates from. So, during the World War II, there were many Nazi medical war crimes that were documented. And in 1946 itself, there was an American military tribunal that opened up criminal proceedings actually against the 23 leading German physicians at that time and administrators for the crimes against humanity, out of which 16 were found to be guilty. They were conducting medical experiments on thousands of camp prisoners without their consent, out of which many participants were actually left permanently crippled or succumbed to death even. So this is what led to the first international document that advocated ever that voluntary participation and informed consent are absolutely essential of the human participant. This was known as the Nuremberg Code of Medical Ethics. And after this, we've seen many such amendments and various documentations that have come about and have further been refined, like the Kefauver amendments that actually came about when thalidomide was being used as a sedative during pregnancy, and which led to many fetal defects, as we all very well know. And this was the very first time that the drug manufacturers were required to mandatorily prove the effectiveness of the product before even marketing it. So this is where the role of FDA was defined in terms of informed consent is required, and also the efficacy and safety of the drug is also an important and evolving concept through these decades of medical research. Then we have the Declaration of Helsinki, we have the Belmont Report, which slowly started formulating the various pillars of a good clinical practice, which were autonomy, beneficence, justice, which overall, just to sum up in a simple manner, means that there should be autonomy of the patient, there must be a voluntary informed consent, no harm should be brought to the human participants, and definitely there needs to be a balanced risk and benefit ratio as well. So Declaration of Helsinki also pretty much focused on the similar pillars, where they also added one more thing, that any medical products that need to be used on human participants must first go through lab and animal testing, and the research protocols must be evaluated by the independent committees like the ethical committee, as was discussed in the previous talk. And also the importance of informed consent and autonomy of the patient. The qualification of the experts that are involved, the investigators that are involved, are highly important and well defined now in the various guidelines, who are the people who can actually engage themselves and involve in these clinical trials. And also the risk and benefit ratio. So the benefit should definitely outweigh the risk that may be posed by the product that is being tested. So, highlighting the importance of clinical trials, of course, we know science has been evolving over time, and it is a very important part. The good clinical practice is nothing but an international guideline that keeps things in place, where the safety of the patient, the autonomy of the patient, the feasibility and viability of the trial itself, the question that is being posed, the way it is conducted is all very well regulated and within the realms of those strict and stable guidelines around the world. So we know that it is fundamental part of clinical research. It should be well-designed and conducted clinical trials, which end up yielding reliable results, and they help in ensuring the participant safety also. But a poorly designed clinical trial will end up wasting resources, and also it has the potential to put the patient's safety at risk. So we know that GCP, which is part of the ICH guidelines, it is generally internationally accepted best practices for conducting clinical trials and device studies. And they are defined as an international ethical and scientific standard for designing, conducting, recording, and reporting trials that involve the participation of human subjects. Compliance with the GCPs, they provide a public assurance also that the rights and safety of participants in human subject research, they are well protected. And that the data that arises from this study is also credible and can thereby go and be a part of the medical guidelines for treatment. So in this talk, we're just going to go through the overview of the core principles of GCP guidelines as they have been defined. And we will go through certain important terminology to respect the time limit that has been provided. And of course, we should be well aware that the GCP training, it can be investigator, co-investigator, sub-investigators, it is mandatory for them to have the GCP certificate as of what is the most updated one, can be achieved from various portals like the Global Health Training Center and the ICH training. And usually it is also mediated by the monitoring team that is that has been delegated to the clinical trial at every site. So the clinical trials, they should be conducted in accordance with the ethics and are consistent with GCP and the applicable regulatory requirements. And before a trial is initiated, foreseeable risks and inconveniences should be weighed against the anticipated benefit for the individual trial subject and society. A trial should be initiated and continued only if the anticipated benefits justify the risk. The rights and safety and well-being of the trial subjects are most important considerations, and they should prevail over all other interests of science and society. The available non-clinical and clinical information on an investigational product should be adequate to support the proposed clinical trial. The clinical trials should be scientifically sound and described in a clear, detailed protocol. A trial then should be conducted in compliance with this set protocol that has received prior IRB or IEC approval and favorable opinion, as we have gone through in the previous talk. The medical care given to and medical decisions made on behalf of the subject should always be with responsibility. Each individual involved in conducting a trial should be qualified by education, training, and experience to perform his or her respective tasks. And voluntarily given informed consent should be obtained from each and every single subject prior to clinical trial participation. So all clinical trial information then has to be mandatorily recorded. It has to be handled and stored in a way that allows its accurate reporting, interpretation, as well as verification. The confidentiality of records that could identify subjects should be protected, respecting the privacy and confidentiality rules in accordance with the applicable regulatory requirements. Then the investigational product should be manufactured, handled, and stored in accordance with applicable good manufacturing practice. They should be used in accordance with the approved protocol. And then the systems with procedures that assure the quality of every aspect of the trial must be implemented. So this all is derived from the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. So the E6 Good Clinical Practice, it was finalized in 1996. That had described the responsibilities and expectations of the stakeholders in the context of the clinical trials. It also covered the aspects of monitoring, reporting, and archiving of clinical trials. And also it included sections that was for essential documents as well as the investigational brochure. The E6R2, which was finalized in 2016, which is most of us also have. We have certificate of the E6R2. It included the integrated addendum approaches to GCP while continuing to ensure human subject protections, and also it updated the standards for electronic records. Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes,
I
ma'am,
can
you're
hear you.
audible.
Sorry. So it also updated the standards for electronic records. Now there were concerns of the E6R2 version. The main concern was that it had a very one-size-fits-all approach to clinical trials. And then there were concerns about ability of clinical trials to meet all GCP requirements in different situations, like during public health emergencies itself. And then there were also concerns that GCP requirements were being applied where it is not even applicable. So the E6R3, which has been recently finalized in 2025, this is actually grounded in the foundational principle of quality by design. That is the main premise around which the revisions have been done. It involves critical thinking. It also utilizes proportionate risk-based approaches and also recognizes that one size does not fit all. So just to give an overview of the R3 version of GCP guidelines, this guideline, it applies to interventional clinical trials of the investigational products that are intended to be submitted to regulatory authorities, and it also may be applicable to other interventional clinical trials of investigational products that are not intended to support marketing authorization applications in accordance with local requirements. Clinical trials, they vary in terms of scale and complexity and cost. So a careful evaluation of the scientific objectives involved in each trial and risks associated with the priorities will help ensure efficiency by focusing on activities critical to achieving the trial objectives. Then the innovation and efficiency and engagement aspect of it. This version also, it encourages the exploration of technology. So the principles are intended to support efficient approaches to trial design and conduct. That means that even if there's an innovative digital health technology such as wearables and sensors that may expand the possible approaches to the trial conduct are encouraged. And the use of technology in the conduct of clinical trials, it should be adapted to fit the participant characteristics as well, and also the particular trial design. Encouraging engagement and inclusivity, it uses the use of innovative clinical trial designs and technologies may help include diverse patient populations as appropriate and enable wider participation also of various human subjects. So the primary focus has been on appropriate quality, and it has quality by design, which should be implemented to identify the factors such as data and processes that are critical to ensuring trial quality, and also risks that threaten the integrity of those factors and ultimately the reliability of the trial results. And the clinical trial processes and risk mitigation strategies implemented to support the conduct of the trial should be proportionate to the importance of the data being collected and the risks to the trial participants' safety and data reliability. So trial designs, this should be operationally feasible, but also avoid unnecessary complexities that may hinder the very conduct of the clinical trial. Now I'll just go through some important terminology. Going through the entire guideline is beyond the purview of the talk, but we can talk about what are the important definitions that we come across during the GCP training also. So clinical trial, it is any interventional investigation in human participants intended to discover or verify the clinical, pharmacological and or other pharmacodynamic effect of an of an investigational product, and or to identify any adverse reactions to an investigational product or products, and or to study absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion of an investigational product with the object of ascertaining its safety and or efficacy. So the IRB or IEC, as we've already gone through in the last talk also, it is an independent body, a reviewer board or a committee, institutional, regional, national or supranational. It's constituted of medical
Tanvi, you
professionals.
have 1 minute to complete.
Yes, sir. So I will skip through this definition as it's already touched upon. Now, this is important because quality by design and monitoring are the two major aspects of the R3 guidelines. And all those planned and systematic actions that are established to ensure that the trial is performed and the data are generated, documented, recorded, and reported in compliance with GCP and the applicable regulatory requirements, and quality control, that is the QC activity. These are the operational techniques and activities undertaken to verify that the requirements for quality of the trial related activities have been fulfilled. Then protocol is a very important document which itself describes the objectives, design, methodology, statistical considerations, and organization of the trial itself. The protocol usually also gives the background and rationale for the trial, but these could be provided in other protocol reference documents as well. Now, monitoring is one of the most important principal QC activities. There is a monitoring plan, which is a document which describes the strategy, methods, responsibilities, and requirements for the trial. And then there is a monitoring report, that is a documented report following site and or centralized monitoring activities. Informed consent and assent are absolutely essential. The consent is a process by which the participant or their legally acceptable representatives, they voluntarily confirm their willingness to participate in a trial after having been informed and been provided with the opportunity to discuss all aspects of the trial that are relevant to the participant's decision to participate. So it is a two-way process, and varied approaches to the provision of the information and discussion about the trial can also be used. Then assent is affirmative agreement of a minor to participate in clinical trial, but the absence of expression of agreement or disagreement should not be misinterpreted as an assent. There are data acquisition tools that are used during the clinical trials, and they can be a paper or electronic tool designed to collect the data and associated metadata from a data originator in a clinical trial according to the protocol that has been designed.
Can you go to your last slide, please?
Yes, sure, sir. So then we know that there are important roles like investigator, sub-investigator, and coordinating investigator. And the sponsor is a company that is
Please go to your
organizing.
last slide.
Yeah, thank you so much. So this has been adapted from the ICH presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Tanvi. Apologies for speeding it up, but we have to complete by 6 o'clock.
Sir.
We now go on to the next presentation by Dr. Soumya Surath Panda. He is a medical oncologist from IMS and some hospital in Bhubaneswar, and is also part of the ICMR Center for Clinical Trials. He is a PI as well, so he knows exactly what he is going to talk about. So Soumya, without much wasting much time, I hand over to you.
Thank you, sir. Can you can we see my full screen?
Sir, we can't see your slides, sir.
Just a minute. Yeah, can you see now?
Yeah, we can see your slide.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So the topic for me is new drugs and clinical trial rules 2019. So what we'll learn in this lecture, we'll learn the draft and final notification, the overview of the NDCT rules with respect to the number of chapters, schedules, rules, different chapters, their key content, and the different schedules and their content, and the applicable rules. So the draft of the new drug clinical trial rules was published in 2018. So whenever there is an amendment to the rule, the CDSO puts up it to the Drug and Technical Advisory Board, the DTAB. DTAB formulates that draft and then sends to the Health Ministry. The Health Ministry looks at the looks in detail and then again sends back for a final notification. So in this case, the draft was formulated in 1st of February 2018 by the DTAB or the Drug Technical Advisory Board. Thereafter, in exercise of the powers conferred by the Section 12 and Section 33 of the Drugs and Cosmetic Act, the central government, after consultation with the DTAB, published the rules by Gazette Notification 227E in the new Drug and Clinical Trial Rules 2019, which is effective from 19th of March 2019. So the draft was formed in February 2018 1st February, and then the final notification came in 19th of March 2019, and we called it as the NDCT Rules 2019. So coming to the overview, these rules have come into force from the date of publication in the official gazette, that is 19th of March 2019, excepting chapter for 4, which shall come into force after 180 days. So one of the chapters, that is 4th chapter, that came into force after 180 days. The said rules contains 13 chapters and 8 schedules. So they shall apply to all the new drugs, investigational new drugs for human use, clinical trial, bioequivalence study, bioavailability study, and ethics committee. So the rules had 13 chapters and 8 schedules, details of which we'll see in the subsequent slides. So this is the overview, the new drug clinical trials and rules 2019, that comprise of 13 chapters, 107 rules, and 8 schedules, and 27 forms. Earlier there was only one form, so that was modified, and lot number of forms, 27 forms, came up in 2019, the NDCT rules. So coming to the chapters, first chapter, you have got 13 chapters. The first chapter, that was the preliminary chapter, and rules applicable were 1 and 2. And what are the key content of this preliminary chapter? It was about the academic clinical trial definition, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, that definition, what is the adverse event, what is the serious adverse event, what is we mean by bioavailability and the bioequivalence. So this, what are the bioavailability and bioequivalence study centers, and the biomedical and health research, what is the central licensing authority, the state licensing authority, the clinical trial protocols, the clinical site, the efficacy, effectiveness. So multiple definitions were given in the chapter 1. Again, the other definitions, like what do you mean by global clinical trial? So that is carried out across multiple countries, that is global clinical trial. What is IND, investigational new drug? Similarly, what is the definition of orphan drug, that is used within less than 5 lakh population? Some rare disease will use the drug. So that is orphan drug when the affected population is less than 5 lakhs. So what is pharmacovigilance? What is the phytopharmaceutical drug? And what do you mean by post-trial access? So multiple definitions were given in first chapter. The second chapter, that was about the authorities and officers, and the key content is central licensing authority, delegation of the power of the central licensing authority, and the controlling officer. Chapter 3 was about ethics committee for clinical trial, bioavailability and bioequivalence study, the constitution, requirement, and the registration of the ethical committee, proceedings of the ethical committee. It was all given in chapter 3, and the rules applicable were from 6 to 14. So the ethics committee for biomedical and health research, this is the chapter 4. So as I told you earlier, chapter 4 came later on after the 180 days from the 19th of March 2019. So after that, it came later. So the ethics committee for biomedical and health research was separate. With the constitution of that ethical committee, the registration, and what do you mean by the committee for the biomedical and health research, that was a separate chapter, chapter number 4. Chapter number 5, that included the clinical trial, bioavailability and bioequivalence study of new drugs and investigational drugs. There are 2 parts. Part A was about clinical trial, part B was bioavailability and bioequivalence study. Chapter 6 was about compensation. So compensation in case of injury or death in clinical trial, the details about that was there in chapter number 6. Chapter number 7 was bioequivality and bioequivalence study centers. So that was about the study centers. So not all study centers are equipped to do a bioavailability or bioequivalence study. Few centers that qualify. So what are the registration of that centers? What is the application, the inspection of those centers? Those parts were there in chapter number 7. Chapter number 8, that was about manufacture. So manufacturing of new drugs or investigational new drugs for clinical trial. So that was there in chapter number 8. So that was about the manufacturing. So the application for permission, how to apply license, how long it will be valid, what are the conditions about the manufacturing of new drugs. So those things were there in chapter number 8. Chapter number 9 was about import. So import of the new drugs and investigation of new drugs for clinical trial or viability was in chapter number 9. So again, while we go for the import, what are the paperwork, for the application, license, how long it will be valid. So those they are there in chapter number 9. That is the import part. Then chapter number 8. So you are importing for a small quantity. So for sale or distribution, that part was there in chapter number 10. So if you are importing the drug or manufacture of the new drug that is meant for only sale or distribution, and those are there in chapter number 10. Chapter number 11 is a bit different. So when you import or manufacture of the unapproved new drug for treatment of patient in government hospital and government medical institution, you want to procure only for a particular specific area, that is in government hospital and government medical institution, then we have to look in detail in that part in the chapter number 11. Coming to chapter number 12, there was amendment of drugs and cosmetic rules 1948. That was not applicable of Schedule Y and Part XA. Earlier it was there, so it was amended that NDCT rules that will override the Schedule Y and Part XA. So that was not applicable further. That amendment was mentioned in chapter number 12 of this particular NDCT rules. So chapter number 12 was important for that. Chapter number 13 consists of miscellaneous, again very important, whichever are not included in chapter number 1 to 12, like pre-submission, post-submission meeting, constitution of expert committee, mode of payment of fees, the debarment of applicant. So those are very, very important. Those are mentioned in the chapter number 13, that is miscellaneous. Now coming to the schedules. So first schedule, that rules applicable 1931, it talks about the general principle and practices for clinical trial. Second schedule, requirement and guidelines for permission to import or manufacture of new drug. Third schedule, conduct of clinical trial. Fourth schedule, requirement and guidelines for conduct of bioavailability and bioequivalent study of new drugs. The fifth schedule, that was post-market assessment. And the sixth schedule, the fee payable for license, permission, and registration certificate. And the seventh schedule, formula to determine the quantum of compensation in the cases of clinical trial related to injury or death. So somebody faces an injury or death, and what is the compensation formula that was mentioned in the seventh schedule. Again, eighth schedule, various forms were there. So eighth schedule contains the forms. I mean, the key highlights of the new drug clinical NDCT rules. So definition of many previously undefined terms have been included. So new definitions have been introduced for, as I mentioned, with the clinical trial side, the efficacy, the orphan drugs. What is the new drug definition that has been modified? So that is there in this particular NDCT rules 2019. Again, the difference from a clinical trial, how it differs from a biomedical and health research, that is there. How it is different from an academic clinical trial or a thesis, that is also there. So in detail, one has to go through this if you are conducting any clinical trial. So how it is different from biomedical and health research. So those things are also mentioned. So how can you apply for a provision of waiver for clinical trials? And so if a drug is approved or marketed in certain subject to certain conditions and confirming conduct of phase 4 study, then provision of waiver. So that part you can apply. So provision of pre-submission meetings was included in this particular. Pre-submission meetings means applicant can discuss their projects with the regulators and subject experts by paying a certain fee before making actual submission to the regulator. Before making the submission to the regulator, they can discuss by paying a fee to the subject experts seeking their guidance about the requirement of the law and the procedure applicable for these projects. So pre-submission meeting was a new thing. Again, post-submission meeting. So if the applicant desires to seek clarification in person in respect of pending application and queries related thereto. So if it is submitted, but again it is pending, so you can again go and discuss that part. So post-submission meeting was also there. So the officer was designated by the Central Licensing Authority that has to answer that within a period of 15 days to the queries that has been put. Again, provision for post-trial access was included. The permission to initiate clinical trial will be valid till 2 years from the date of issue unless extended by licensing authority. Enrollment status should be submitted on quarterly basis to the licensing authority. Again, 6 monthly status reports on the trial should be submitted in the SUGAM portal. Early termination of clinical trial should be reported to the licensing authority within 30 working days. So if you are terminating the clinical trial early, then you have to report to the licensing authority within 30 working days. In case of study-related injury or death, compensation should be provided within 30 calendar days of receipt of orders from the central licensing authority. So if there is an injury or death and you are going to provide, the compensation is going to be provided, and it should be provided within 30 calendar days on the receipt of order from the central licensing authority. There are defined timelines for review and approval of this clinical trial. 90 days for the global clinical trials, 30 days for investigation new drugs being developed in India. Then the application fee was increased in the validity of clinical trial approval for 2 years to initiate the study. So it was extended by, it can be extended by 1 year. So the validity part, the application fees part, the timelines, they were all defined in this NDCT rules 2019. And in case of an ethics committee of a clinical trial rejects the approval of the protocol, the details of the same why it was rejected, those things have to be submitted. The central assessing authorities will be informed about the approval granted by the ethics committee within a period of 15 working days of the grant of such a approval. So the ethics committee, they are getting a approval, then it must be informed to the central licensing authority. Again, ethics committee, which has already been discussed. So there are the ethics committee for clinical trials and the biomedical and health research, they are different. So the clinical trials, registration in CDSO, but biomedical health, registration in CDSO and DHR is required. Registration duration is also different. The validity of EC registration was increased. Earlier it was 3 years, it was increased to 5 years. Renewal applications shall be submitted within 90 days to expiry of registration. So if we are going to, EC is going to expire, the registry, the period is going to expire, so you can renew it prior. Then the composition of the ethical committee, that was also there. Again, the DCI has to be informed about the approval granted by the EC within 15 working days. And in case of rejection of city application, the applicant may request to reconsider the application within the period of 60 days. So it is rejected, again, it can be reapplied within 60 days. Again, very, very important. Serious adverse event reporting timeline that has changed for the sponsor 14 calendar days from awareness of SAE or death. So each term was important. So whenever the PI has to inform, it is within 24 hours. But if you have the detailed report of the awareness of the SAE or death within 14 calendar days, the SAE has to be informed. Again, the periodic safety update report, the PSUR. So the periodic safety update report content and structure there has to be aligned with the ICH guidelines, and within 30 calendar days it has to be informed. Revision of putting order of suspension. So if it is there, then it has to be informed in the public domain. So what we learned about from the NDCR 2019 is that the overview of, and now from the talk we learned about the overview of NDCT rules 2019. So what are the different chapters? What are they included? There are 13 chapters, 8 schedules. So various definitions covered by under this rule, the rules applicable to different chapter schedules. So those things we learned. And again, there are some key highlights or changes that was there that was important for all of us while doing or conducting a clinical trial. So we must read through the NDCT rules 2019. With that, I conclude my talk. Thank you. I hand it back to the organizers.
Thank you very much, Soumya. That was a fantastic overview. And we will now move on to the next presentation, and that is by Dr. Surinder Kher. He is Executive Head Clinical Research, Aster Hospital, Bangalore. And in fact, he has in colleagues were those who actually introduced me to clinical research many, many years ago. So you can say that he has a lifetime of experience, and we will definitely learn a lot about academic clinical trials from Dr. Surinder. Over to you, Surinder.
Thank you, Purvish. Thank you so much. Can somebody put my slides on? Can you make it full screen, please? Thank you. So we have gone into all the details about the ethics committee. Since we have 15 minutes, my focus would be here to talk about the difference as ethics committee members, how you will handle academic clinical research versus the clinical trials that are sponsored by sponsors. Now, background, I will generally know that because most of us come from institutions that run a lot of internal research, which is investigator-initiated research, especially which come from educational institutions. So scientific publications in peer-reviewed journals are the gold standard for the validation of advancement among all of us, the medical community. And publications for any research group are the backbone of scientific progress. And academic and regulatory research are similar, but the research purpose is very different. They are for the products that are undergoing clinical trials, the whole idea is to get them to the market. Ours is basically to find out better answers in terms of our medical progress, our medical practice, so that we are able to find out newer, answer some of the questions that we have in our routine practice. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is basically, I just put in a background of, we have the ethics committee requirements, what the ethics committee members are supposed to do when they are reviewing procedures, when they are reviewing proposals that come for. Now, my request here would be that all the members who are of the ethics committee, they need to look at these academic studies a little differently, in the sense the responsibilities of looking at these proposals is even more to the ethics committee compared to the studies that are done, which are covered by the regulatory agencies, because the sponsors cover it, there are monitors, there is a lot of coverage that happens. So the responsibility and onus of being a quasi-regulatory authority comes onto the ethics committee. So it's even more important from that perspective. Could we go to the next? So how are academic or investigator-initiated studies defined? So studies conceived, planned, and managed by individual physicians, researchers, or an institution or a group of collaborative clinics, because we try to run collaborative research with different institutions across the world. So wide range of studies, which are clinical trials of new drugs and real-world prospective or retrospective studies, are included in this group. So they help in repurposing of drugs and investigating health research questions relevant to clinical practice. And data from real-world settings, which are applicable to population studies, can help in developing hospital, state, country-specific health guidelines and policies. That's what we do research for. We go and present papers, we go and talk about our practices, and that becomes the protocol for the next, based on what we have found in our academic through publications. So that is the whole idea of academic or investigator-initiated research. Now, can we go to the next slide? Now, there is a challenge. Now, like just now we went in the previous session, we went through how academic clinical trials are defined, as per our legal laws. So, which is description of an academic clinical. This is verbatim from the new drugs and clinical trial rules. Now, here it's very important to differentiate a little bit, which I will try to address in my next slide. The term academic clinical trials is defined in the NTCT rules. This trial can be conducted by an investigator, an academic, or a research institution on a drug already approved for certain claims. So all drugs which are already in the market are marketed for a certain claim, you can run an investigator-initiated study on that. So from a general perspective, because in academics we run a lot of observational research as well. So here we have to differentiate very clearly, and I'm sure many of you might be knowing the ICMR is coming out with a new guideline on investigator-initiated research. Now, when we talk about the definition of investigator-initiated research, it talks about interventional studies, clinical trials. It does not cover observational studies. So again, going through this discussion, the objective of the trial may be to explore new indication or a new route of administration or a new dose or a new dosage form. So that's all we can do as per the legal regulatory framework of this definition. Such trials are conducted solely for academic or research purposes and not for seeking any regulatory approval. So these studies cannot be submitted to regulatory agencies to seek an regulatory permission for the new dose or the new route of administration. Outcomes of these can only be published, not even used for promotional purposes, because a lot of times sponsors might fund it and then they cannot use it for their promotional pieces for that, because here we have done this study, so and so doctors have done it, this is a publication, it cannot be used for that purpose anywhere in the world. And ethics committees have to get an approval for these studies, which is mandatory, and they have to be CTRI registered, and no requirement to obtain permission from conducting an academic trial from the licensing authority. That's one of the reasons why a lot of academic trials are done seeking, because you are bypassing the regulatory authority, DCGI, because it is allowed as long as your product is in the market, it is not a new product. Okay, let's go to the next slide now. So what are not considered IICTs or academic clinical trials? So this is very clear. This should not be confused. We do not consider IICTs, which are interventional studies, as observational studies don't come under IICT guidelines or rules that are defined in the academic clinical research. Okay, it does not include already established standard of care, all new investigation and new drugs, innovative therapies, novel therapies that have been approved for human use. It will not be covered. New vaccines, any new product in any category, or new surgical techniques. Sometimes we want to use new surgical techniques because surgical studies are less. They try to use new techniques. Those also would not be covered under these investigator-initiated studies. Next slide, please. Now, some of the challenges I have put in, because all of us work in institutions, and typically we have found out, though we have all the laws written, guidelines, ICMR guidelines, but how do we really put those into practice. And a lot of times we have been, because India in the last 20-25 years, we have been kind of taking baby steps one by one, considering the extent, the quality, and the capacity of our institutions. There are certain things which have come in, which become sometimes as, challenges for, but they are prerequisites for academic research. They are challenges for an individual researcher within an institution, and an oncologist, Dr. Purvish, should want to do this, but this is how challenges come across. So if you're doing a collaborative study, which is worldwide, you're working with John Hopkins, or you're working with MD Anderson, or anywhere, or you want to use it across globe for multiple countries, you have to go to the health minister screening committee approval if funding is from outside of India. Second, you have to go through the BioRap registration. This is a new requirement prior to HMSC approval. So why I'm mentioning these are mandatory things, but these happen to be kind of impediments, administrative hassles, as I would call it. And if you're getting a foreign funding, you have to get an FCRA in case of foreign funding. So you should have that. And the guidelines and the restrictions for FCRAs is known to everybody in this country. Now, trial registration, international registry, CTRI of India, this is not such a problem, but it's a mandatory requirement. Issues related to sample exports. Now, if you are exporting samples out in a collaborative research, they are not allowing you from more than 10%. Whether this is right or wrong, that is a different debate, but these are the constraints that we have currently. So data quality and safety of the intervention is something that would actually come to the, like, for example, the monitoring. So commercial studies, which are sponsor driven studies, you have monitors coming overseeing that. But for academic studies, there is nothing of such nature. So this becomes a challenge. And all these challenges, I'm really directing all these challenges to all the ethics committee members, that while they are actually reviewing these procedures, reviewing these proposals, they need to consider all these factors while they are reviewing these studies in their ethics committees. So auditing, how are you going to really look at, is there a DSMB? So these are challenges, forming a DSMB. Now, sponsor studies, it can be done, but individual investigators, it's a challenge. Then financial arrangements of the conductor of the study, free medical management and compensation for patients, which is a requirement, especially intervention, patient travel, inconvenience, ancillary care, and post-research access of the medication. If you are using this, how do you address this? Now, these challenges are for all studies, but become big challenges for academic studies, because most of these studies, if they are investigated initiated, how do you cover it under insurance? Who pays for that money? So that is very critical for ethics committee members to evaluate. Similarly, free medical management, something goes wrong, who takes care of this? Is insurance prepared for this? So all these are very critical, important factors. Go to the next slide, please. Another point which the ethics committee members have to really look at, the conflict of interest that can happen. Now, these are some of the examples. We may not be able to cover everything, but examples of perceived influence of are like the choice of inferior comparator, because investigator is designing himself or herself, everything. Now, is there any manipulation of the randomization process? How they are randomizing? What is that procedure? Now, that has to be defined in the proposal, and these are the questions that the ethics committee should be asking. All these. How do you stop and continue the trial? Who decides that? Now, is there any fabrication of data, because there is no oversight? And is that over? Now, the ethics committee says that there has to be oversight, we read it everywhere, but what are the mechanisms that we are having in an institutional situation, whether we have it or not? And this is one of the reasons why most of the student thesis or most of the research that happens is more of either retrospective or a prospective observational research. We're not really able to make interventional because of some of these criteria. But if there are, these are the things that one has to really look at. Now, some of the strategies to manage these conflicts of interest are basically how do you ask for disclosures from the members who are doing this study? Exclusion of funder from the design and sometimes a lot of these, you approve for funding, you approve for grants. What is the role of the funder in this whole design of the research? So you try to make sure that there is no conflict from that point of view. Now, you can create independent committees or subcommittees within the ethics committee, or ask the institution to create such, or the system within the institution who is trying to get into, because some of the leading institutions like Tata Memorials and AIMS and others, they do have these procedures in place to follow such, but how does it get replicated to, larger research across the country? And the contracts ensuring complete access to data, no restriction by funder on analysis and reporting. All these are important. So when we are reviewing these, how these questions are very, very pertinent to be asked to the investigator who is initiating this study. Next slide, please. So again, this is again one of the selection of participants. How do you do heightened risk of selection? Because the patient is coming to, he's also a doctor, he's also a treating physician, and the patient is there. Do you use convenient sampling methods to recruit the patient's past participants? Because this can lead to therapeutic misconception also, because the patient feels that the doctor is treating me, not really, even if you sign the consent, considering our situation. It's very important to look at these aspects when you are reviewing these proposals in the ethics committee. So ethics committee members have a lot of responsibility, especially in the academic studies, because for commercial studies, they know sponsor is taking care, all the responsibilities go to them, and then you have a standard procedure, monitoring is there. How do we look at that aspect? So careful participant selection is essential to ensure fairness, minimize bias, and protect participants' rights. This is the question that we have to ask when we review such proposals from the investigator. Next slide, please. Okay, what are the implications for researchers, institutions, and the ethics committees? Because they are the parties that get involved in academic research. For the institution, it's a requisite funding to pay for research-related injury, insurance, and corpus fund. This is all mentioned in our ICMR guideline for biomedical research, which is the law actually, because that's referred in our drugs and clinical trial rules. So how do you ensure that this corpus fund is available, the insurance is covered for these interventional studies? The principal investigator or the institute has to bear the responsibility of the sponsor. So they behave like sponsors in that case. A lot of institutions run academic programs, and the theses are done is a part of a requirement for these fellowships or for DNB students. Now, how do you cover all of those? Many institutions have moved further. I know most of the people who are present, who are sitting as audience, are ethics committee members. They would very, very much relate that these are the gaps, and they are still working within those gaps. But we have to make sure that how do we go beyond this? And that's one of the reasons, as we become better, that's how the institutions can become better. So PI is expected to follow good clinical practices, GCPs, all that is required. IECs have to have the experience and expertise in benefit risk assessment to ensure patients are protected at all times, because this is one of the fundamental requirements and the responsibilities of IECs. So how do we do that risk assessment based review of all the proposals, depending on what type of study and what is the risk exposure that this proposal poses to the patients? How do we put the mechanism to ensure compliance to GCP, ICMR, and NDCT rules? How do we ensure, because it's responsibility of only the ethics committee here, institution and the investigators may not have this responsibility because they themselves are the sponsors. So there is a need for robust scientific review and unbiased robust review, which will improve the protocol and identify the risks involved. Can we go to the next slide, please? So responsibilities of investigator, how do we address some of these? Investigator-initiated CTs do not require regulatory clearance. There is a 30-day provision, I think somebody would have addressed it, that if you have a doubt whether this is an academic or a non-academic study, you can refer to it to the DCGI. If you hear back within 30 days, good enough. If not, then you can proceed and consider it as an academic. So EC requirement is important, that you have to get an approval, and ECs have to have bandwidth of human resources. So secretaries and chairperson of the ethics committees, besides the members, they represent, because secretaries are from the institution, they have to put their foot down and make sure that these things are there. We have been operating without those many things, but I think we need to go forward and ensure that we follow some of these and try to push some of these things that we don't have facilities as of today. The responsibility of monitoring and investigating initiated CT tests with EC, which has approved the CT, and ECs have to be equipped with requisite capacity and experience to provide risk proportionate review and oversight monitoring of these ongoing trials. Can we go to the next slide, please? So key steps that can be taken to ensure initial and ongoing sites. So compensation for research-related harm, including death, is the responsibility of the host institution. And the ethics committees have to put their foot down to have that insurance in place, at least, if not a corpus fund. Obtain an undertaking from the researchers as long as the protocol that they will follow the protocol, they will be compliant to GCPs, and they will report all reporting ECs. So these are some of the things that the ethics committees can mandate and ask for these from the investigators and ensure some kind of oversight to begin with. Now, create SOPs for oversight, audit, and compensation for research-related injuries. Now, this is something that the EC has to. So all EC members who are a part of ethics committees, fortunately or unfortunately, it has been over the years since we started for last 30 years. It has been okay. There is nothing, something is there. Let's follow whatever we have. But I think we have to progress. Otherwise, we'll remain where we have been. So unless the ethics committees put their foot down, it's very important that these things will happen. Though it is difficult, but that's the way to go forward. Invite subject matter experts to provide their input, because there are all types of studies that are there, and the general perception that, okay, ethics committee, this has nothing to do with ethics, so science will be taken care of by somebody else. That's not the correct way. All institutions do not have scientific review. It is the responsibility of the ethics committee to make sure that the study is valid scientifically, ethically, and from all perspectives. So to have this notion that, well, it has nothing to do with ethics is not the right thinking from the ethics committee's point of view. It's a multidisciplinary. That is why we have clinicians sitting. That's why we have legal. That's why we have social people sitting in the committee. They are supposed to look at the science and the ethics both. Seek clarifications from principal investigator if you have doubts, and get subject matter experts. You are doing a stem cell study, get the stem cell people as experts for that meeting. The subcommittee can share, so you can have subcommittees for all these different types of reviews that you are doing, and create, you have to create these procedures within your committee to see that, because all members may not be available at all the time. Create those subcommittees. Create a monitoring subcommittee for monitoring. Rotate the members so that everyone gets trained on it. Some of it we follow. As an example, I'll tell you, we follow it. Create SOPs for monitoring process, SE review, etc. These are certain things that the ethics committees have to do, because typically members should not be just attending the meetings and doing it. I can tell you, even the review of proposals is not done on time. They come for the presentation only. So we have to go beyond that if we are really looking at this. And academic research is the responsibility completely. All research, in fact, academic being more important. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in summary, investigator-initiated or academic CTs are important tools for improved medical knowledge and better clinical practice. Nobody would want to stop research. Everybody would want to do it. Publications is critical for all of us. So a structured approach with appropriate monitoring oversight will enhance the credibility and robustness of the data generated. The perspective of Indian research going global, these are some of the issues that perceptions are created. If we are able to address these, I think we'll be in a better shape, and it's all within us. There is nothing rocket science around it, but we have to push it. It's a time-consuming thing, but we have to push it. This shall build confidence in the stakeholders about safeguarding the interests and rights of all the participants. IRBs, ECs to play a significant role in ensuring academic research, risk-based review and monitoring, most important, and seek institutional commitment from function and operation. Difficult task, but we have to push it. Next. I think this is the end of my study. If we have questions, we'll take it later. But let's get going. I made this plan. We have to have an action plan. Please take it as a request from me, because this is what our country needs. And all of us together can do it. Otherwise, it's not possible. Thank you very much for your
Thank you very much,
patience.
Surinder. That was absolutely amazing. And now we have to move to the next one. Dr. Natasha Das is a medical communications consultant and a physician with over 26 years of experience. I have personally interacted with her, and we have been faculty in several workshops, hands-on workshops for communications and medical writing, as well as publications. So I know that she is the right person to speak on this subject. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you so much, sir. Good evening, everybody. Please
Your volume is less. Can you increase your volume, please?
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
And is my slide visible? The screen visible? I'll make
you can make it full screen, but we can see your slides.
Yeah. Now it's better, right?
Yeah, perfect.
So the topic assigned to me is ICMR National Ethical Guidelines and Informed Consent. Now, why do we need an informed consent? The guidelines, of course, say that it is to protect the participant of a study. But in reality, it also protects the investigators and EC members. That's why a lot of importance has to be put on how the informed consent process is conducted. Right? What if the participant tells you someday that I did not know I was enrolled in the research study? I did not sign the paper after reading it. I just signed it. Right? Or I read it, but I did not understand any of the medical terminologies. It was in English, so I did not understand. I was not told about the side effects. I was just told about the benefits of the medicine. I was not given a chance to ask questions. They asked me to sign in the last minute, so I had no time. I just signed it without reading. Or they say that I did not know that I could even say no to my physician. Right? So to protect investigators and EC members, as well as to protect the participant, these guidelines were framed. It's called the ICMR's National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical and Health Research Involving Human Participants. This is the 2017 guideline. And if you go to the document in the section 5, you will find about informed consent process. With the limited time that we have, we'll focus on some essential components like that. In the process, you need to provide relevant information. We'll talk about what is relevant information and how you will ensure that the information is understood. Also, that you need to assure the patient or the participant has autonomy to choose and ensure that there is proper documentation of the entire process of informed consent. Now, the requisites for this is the participants should be capable of understanding what is being told to them. They should be capable of deciding for themselves and should also be capable to convey what their decision is. If the participant is not capable of doing all these things, it is possible to take the consent of a legally acceptable authorized representatives called the LAR. IC process must be completed before any study related procedure starts. Right? So, of course, in all stages, you have to maintain the privacy and confidentiality of the participants. Even if they say no for participating in a particular study, you need to maintain their privacy and confidentiality. What is relevant information? First and foremost, the participant must be told that this is a research. They will be informed about the study's purpose, the procedures that will be followed, what are the potential benefits. Along with that, they should also be told about what are the potential risks of the procedures, right? And for how long do they have to participate in this? What are the selection criteria? What are the criteria on the basis of which you are selecting this particular participant? What are the exclusion criteria, inclusion criteria? How will you maintain the confidentiality of the person? Does the person have the right to withdraw? You have to mention that yes, the person has the right to withdraw at any given time. And if they have any questions, who should they contact? What is the contact information? Do they get any compensation for the study? And also a statement saying that the participation is entirely voluntary and they can withdraw at any time. For more information on what is relevant information, my slides are not moving just but I don't know what's happening. Okay. Okay. So I'll go by this if this works. So for more information, you could go to box number 5.1, where there is information about what are the essential elements in an informed consent document and also what are the additional elements that you need to put in. Now, to ensure that the participant has understood all the information, you must ensure that whatever information you provide is accurate and in a very simple language and also sensitive to the cultural and social context of the particular participant. In a country like India, where we have multiple languages that people speak in or write in, having an informed consent form only in English or English and Hindi is not sufficient. For different states, different patient, participants, you may have to have, the informed consent forms and the patient information sheet in different languages. For this, translations have to be done of the original informed consent form, which is in English, and then a back translation to ensure that there is consistency in messaging. And all these, whether it is the English language ICF and PIS, or the vernacular language PIS and ICF, all these have to be reviewed and approved by the EC before the informed consent process starts. Together, the patient information sheet and the informed consent form together are called the informed consent document. What is the difference between the two? Patient information sheet provides all the information about the relevant study, whereas informed consent form is an acknowledgement by the participant that they have understood what has been told to them and all their queries have been answered, and they agree to participate in the study. Another essential component of the ICF process is to ensure that the individual has an autonomy to choose. For this, we need to give them enough time to read the documents provided, informed consent documents, and if necessary, they should have enough time to discuss this with their family and friends or whoever they want to discuss it with, and also to seek clarification for the doubts from the researchers or the research team. Right. Now, if a person is not an adult and is not is a child, then they instead of providing consent, they provide what is known as assent. For children under 7 years of age, an assent is not required. The patient's the parents' consent is enough. For children between 7 to 12 years, the guidelines say that oral and verbal assent should be taken in the presence of the parents or the LAI. For children above 12 years, a written assent has to be taken. And this assent form should be signed by the child as well as by the parents and LAI. Right. Now, whether you should have the assent from just one parent or both parents are required. Now, ideally, yes, both parents, but then it is a very tricky situation. Sometimes you may not have both parents present, or both parents may not agree to it. Now, for this, the protocol should have enough guidance, which has been approved by the EC, that how the thing will be managed, how such a situation will be managed if one parent agrees and the other parent does not agree for pediatric studies. Right. Now, for details of the consent for children or assent for children, you can look at these two boxes in the guideline. This is box 6.5 and box 6.6. They have details about this. Now, responsibility of the researchers in getting the informed consent signed by the participants, right? They should use only the EC approved version of the PIS and ICF. Even if they're using vernacular translation, that should also have been approved by the EC. And they should not put a restriction on the patient's right to ask questions or discuss with others or take time to decide. They should be allowed to take their time and decide whether they want to participate in the study. Ensure that the patient is competent and has understood all aspects of the study. How do you do that? You could ask questions and get to understand whether they have really comprehended what the study is about, and allow them to ask questions, right? And what if the participants or the legally acceptable representative is illiterate? In that case, an literate impartial person can be taken into consideration. They need to be present there and they should not be connected to the study. They should be present throughout the IC process, right? Like I mentioned this earlier, that if you want to check whether they have understood or not, you could put a test of understanding also when possible. Participants willing to participate but not willing to or cannot sign or give a thumb impression. In that case, what you do, you can have a oral consent, which is approved by the EC, right? And PI, the participant and an impartial witness should be visible in the frame. The AV consent, when it is taken, they all should be visible in a single frame. But this is not routinely done in all clinical studies. We will come to when AV consent is a mandate, right? Now, another responsibility of the researcher is to ensure free treatment if there is a research-related injury. Also, this one I was not sure of this. I got to know recently that researchers have to ensure that participant can continue to access routine care even if they decide to withdraw from the study. They should have access to the routine care, not the trial study related care. Now, the three essential components we discussed. After that, the fourth one is that you have to ensure proper documentation of the informed consent form, right? Each participant or their LAR must sign and date the ICF. If the participant is illiterate or the LAR illiterate, I've talked about this, and partial literate witness can be there. This can be another patient in the ward who is not included in the study, or can be somebody from the social service department, but not a relative of the participant, right? If the participant cannot sign, they can put thumb impression. Researcher needs to ensure that the person who has administered the consent, that is the researcher usually, has to sign and date it too, not only the participant. I don't know what's happening. Okay, now okay, proper documentation. Now, what is the case where AV recording is required? For clinical trials on vulnerable population, AV recording is mandatory, but otherwise AV recording is not mandatory for all clinical studies, right? Now, who are the vulnerable populations? There's a list that I've provided here. Now, for I thought this was only for the oncology ECs. For oncology researchers, this is critical, terminally ill, or in search of new interventions having exhausted all therapies. So vulnerable people are those who are relatively or absolutely incapable of protecting their own interests. This could be children, this could be economically or socially disadvantaged people, tribals, refugees, homeless people, or this could be people with mental illnesses or cognitive impairments, people with rare disease, which is stigmatizing, then people with diminished autonomy, like people from the defense background, or those who are students, those who are healthcare workers. So these are all vulnerable populations. Now, re-consent or fresh consent. Once the consent has been taken and documented, when do we need to get a new consent or a fresh consent? This is when new information related to the study becomes available. And such information should have implication for the participant or should change the benefit risk ratio. Now, if the unconscious patient has become conscious and can give consent, we go back for a reconsent. If a child has become an adult, if long-term follow-up is required, or there has been some amendment to the study protocol, IB, or other essential documents, then a reconsent is required. Or if there is a possibility that the identity of the participant may be disclosed in upcoming publications. EC may grant a consent waiver if the waiver is scientifically justified, like in retrospective studies where the patients cannot be identified, or in research where anonymized data is being used, or anonymized biological samples are being used, some types of public health studies, some national health program evaluation studies, or research on data that is already available in the public domain. For those, EC can give a consent waiver. Whenever in doubt, it's better to reach out to the EC and check if a consent waiver can be obtained. Now, after the consent is obtained, it is important to give the copy of the PIS as well as the signed ICF to the participant. One copy will be given to the participant, and the original PIS and signed ICF should be archived as mentioned in the protocol. Right? For how long should it be archived? It is dependent on what is mentioned in the protocol. What type of study is it? If it's a clinical study, not a clinical trial, then 3 years is sufficient. But if it is a clinical trial, for 5 years, all the documents need to be archived. Now, to acknowledge the sources from which I gathered this information, one is the ICMR National Ethics New Drugs and Clinical Trials Amendment Rules 2024. Now, this has been approved, but has not come to force as yet. It will be in force from April 1st, 2025. I also thank Dr. Purvish Parikh because he shared some slides with me, which got me started on these slides. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Natasha. That was a fantastic exposition about how to take the informed consent and what are the particular characteristics when we have vulnerable population and what else do we need to do for them. Now we move on to the last part of the presentation, which was on essay reporting. So for this essay reporting, I'm going to be making the presentation. And this is in place of Dr. Vasu. Dr. Vasu Babu was supposed to take this topic. Unfortunately, he is unwell and he's got a very severe throat infection. So he just can't speak, even though he can, be visible, but he cannot speak. So apologies to all of you on his behalf, and I will take the topic of adverse reactions. So the puzzle includes adverse reactions, serious adverse reactions, and SUSAR. And these three terminologies we will go through as we move forward. So why is it important to have a drug safety database? The importance is for the safety of the patients as well as the safety of future patients. And therefore, anything that goes wrong with the patient while on a clinical trial or for a post-marketing surveillance, data reporting of safety is very important. So what is included in the safety database? It is serious adverse event, and I will explain to you what is the meaning of that. Also serious and or non-serious adverse event from sources other than clinical trials. So even if in daily practice, if a patient has something which goes bad while on the treatment, we should have that reported. And it could be in the form of literature as well. So what is an adverse event? An adverse event is an untoward medical occurrence in a patient or a clinical investigation subject who is being administered a pharmaceutical product and which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with the treatment. So while reporting on an adverse event, is the drug or the investigational product responsible for this untoward medical occurrence is not important. Which means that anything that happens to a patient should be assessed, treated if necessary, and recorded in the source documents. This is regardless of the suspected relationship. For example, falling down the stairs, or development of headache, or pain at the site of injection, or even a dog bite on the road. These are to be reported as adverse events, and later on we find out whether there was any relationship with the study medication or the drug. So these are examples of adverse events not related to the study or study medication. So on day 4, patient complained of mild headache. Examination was normal. Paracetamol was given and study drug was continued. Next day, the headache is over. Paracetamol is discontinued and the headache does not repeat again even when the study drug is administered. So this is clearly an indication that this untoward medical effect of headache was not related to the study medication. Now let's move on to what is a serious adverse event. And please understand, serious does not necessarily mean severe. Even a trivial adverse event that fulfills the criteria to call it serious has to be reported. So any adverse event which occurs at any dose that causes death of the patient is obviously serious, or it leads to something that is life-threatening. In other words, immediate risk of death from that reaction, that is supposed to be a serious adverse event. If it results in hospitalization or prolongation of an existing hospitalization, it results in a persistent or significant disability or incapacity, or it results in a congenital abnormality or birth defect. These are all serious adverse events. Now, what is the importance of this? Important medical event may result in death, be life-threatening, or require hospitalization, may be considered as a serious adverse event drug experience based on appropriate medical judgment. So medical judgment is extremely important and the PI plays a very crucial role in this. Example of important medical events. Supposing the patient has allergic bronchospasm, which requires intensive treatment in the emergency room or at home, this falls into the category of serious adverse event, even though he may not be admitted to the hospital or ICU. If the patient has a blood dyscrasia or develops a convulsion that does not require inpatient hospitalization, that is still a serious adverse event. And if there is a development of drug dependence or drug abuse, that should be considered as a serious adverse. Any additional adverse experience which concern healthcare professional or the investigator serious should also be reported as serious. Now let us look at what is meant by hospitalization. Initial hospitalization in any inpatient admission, even if less than 24 hours. For chronic or long-term inpatients, inpatient admissions also includes transfer from one department or one ward to the other within the hospital. For instance, the patient from a psychiatric ward goes to the medical floor, or patient from medical floor goes to the intensive care unit. These are examples where it will not fulfill into the criteria of inpatient admission. Patient is going to hospice, patient is going to respite care, there is skilled nursing facilities or nursing home where the patient is going, or the patient is on the outpatient basis or ambulatory basis, or he is just kept for observation. Admission for treatment of pre-existing condition which is not associated with the development of a new adverse event while in the study is not part of hospitalization. Also, in India, there are many times their patient has no place to sleep and therefore he is kept in the ward. That is also called hospitalization, which doesn't fulfill the criteria of serious adverse events. When is the hospitalization not reportable? If there is an administrative admission, for instance, for a yearly physical exam, or a protocol specified admission during the clinical trial. So patient, for instance, needs an intrathecal injection specifically for the trial, and the trial mentions that the patient needs to be admitted, then this is not a serious adverse event. And also for some very elective procedures like elective cosmetic surgery. If the hospitalization is for an unknown reason, it should be reported immediately as a serious adverse event, even if this hospitalization is at some other nursing home or hospital or city. Now, what about prolongation of hospitalization? If the patient was admitted for say 3 days and because of the medical ailment or a medical accident, the patient requires to stay for a longer time, then this would fall under the definition of serious adverse event. When is prolongation of hospitalization not reportable? For example, if the patient has to be transferred from the hospital to a nursing home, but the nursing home is full, and therefore there is no bed available in hospice or nursing home, then this is not called prolongation of hospitalization. When should the SAE be reported? He should be reported as soon as possible. And during the clinical study, it begins from the time that the subject starts the study medication or procedure, or a placebo or the active comparator drug, or any protocol specified background drug that is administered to him. When should the SAE be reported? It is a continuous process. As the patient progresses through the ailment, he gets worse or he gets better, everything has to be reported. And it should continue to be reported up to 30 days after the last dose of study medication. What are the responsibilities of the investigator? If a serious adverse event occurs during a clinical trial, sponsor must be contacted immediately. And so also the ethics committee has to be contacted immediately. Ethics committee in turn has to report it to the DCGI or the drug control. SAE reporting guidelines for initial as well as follow-up reports. It should contain a unified diagnosis if it is known, or a provisional diagnosis. The medical terminology used should be appropriate and consistent. For instance, you can't say that this discomfort in the abdomen once and then say pain in the abdomen if it refers to the same thing. We should provide as much information as possible at the time of the report. However, if there is one particular report or information not available, it should not delay the reporting of the serious adverse event. An SAE report must have minimum information, which is the description of the event, name of the subject or the participant in the drug and the study title, and how do you identify the subject. That is a code. SAE reporting, as I mentioned earlier, is to the sponsor, which is immediately, and to ethics committee, who will then report to the drug authorities. Review and assessment of all initial and follow-up SAEs is reported for the following points: about its seriousness, about its expectedness in response to the investigator brochure, and has it happened to other patients earlier? Is it related to the study medication? If the study medication is discontinued, does it go away? And when the study medication is reintroduced, does it come back on? And regulatory reporting requirements. Now, expectedness of adverse event or serious adverse event depends on whether it's included in the investigator's brochure or not. An unexpected adverse event is more serious than an expected adverse event because we don't know enough about this unexpected event, and therefore it needs greater attention. Therefore, we have the term called SUSAR, which is suspected unexpected serious adverse reaction. So this is not in the investigator's brochure, so it is unexpected. And it is suspected to be related to the trial intervention or medication, and therefore it is SUSAR. Determining relationship to the drug is also important. Causality and relatedness will ultimately determine how safe the new drug is and whether it will get permission for marketing approval. And therefore, the review requires all known adverse events of the drug, any temporal relationship of the event to the dose, and all D challenges or real challenges information, as I just pointed. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the keys to the SAE puzzle is to ask the following question: why did it occur? Who was the patient or subject where it occurred? Under what circumstances it occurred? Where did it occur? And when did it occur? If we put all these questions together and answers together, then it forms the answer to the puzzle, and then we know the relatedness and whether the study medication is safe or not. With this presentation, I will stop talking. And now we go to the last part, which is the question answers. You can put your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I will then unmute you so you can ask your question. Anybody has any questions? In the meantime, I will put the link to the final MCQs in the chat box. Please copy that link and then use that to answer. This link is to be used only by people who have registered for and attended this webinar, this training session. Dr. Sairam has raised his hand. I will unmute him so he can ask the question. Let me just see where he is. Dr. Sairam, can you unmute yourself?
Sir,
Please ask your question.
so if the patient is non-compliant, say for example, is smoking in the bathroom or is taking alcohol while on the trial, when the patient is not compliant,
Yes.
those things has to be reported when we come to know it, or what is the thing?
So it should be recorded in the medical records. Two things have to be recorded. What is the incidence? When did it occur? And that you have cautioned the patient not to follow. It may not be a serious adverse event, but you report to the sponsor so the sponsor can take remedial measures or take a decision on whether that person is violating the trial sufficient to be discontinued from the trial. So reporting to ethics committee and reporting to the sponsor is important, and you document in the medical records what exactly has happened. But it need not be a serious adverse. Amitabh?
Good evening, sir. First of all, I would like to thank you for such an excellent and such an in-depth presentation on the ethics committee and its role. Sir, I have a question to ask about the academic clinical drug trial, which was presented very well.
Yes.
Supposing if the off-label use of a particular drug becomes in the course of the trial becomes useful, and the PI documents it that it can be useful for other patients as well,
Right.
other participants as well. So can the PI also apply for a copyright and patent? But there's a line which says that the academic clinical trial cannot look for cannot
Commercial. It cannot be used. The data cannot be used for seeking approval. And
right.
the data cannot be used for commercial purposes.
Right. But
Surinder, I will pass on to you to answer in more detail.
Can it be copyrighted and patented?
I'll do that. So first and foremost, as the rules go by, if this person or the investigator who is finding that there is positivity in the study during the study, because you will know the results at the end, and if you feel it was a pilot or something, then he has to file for that patent and go to the regulatory for seeking that patent, or go to the regulatory for seeking a new permission from a regulatory perspective, because then it doesn't remain academic. Now there are a lot of other factors for going to the regulators. He has to look at all of this, because if he has found something, he can patent it. There is no problem in the patent. But then if he has to go to the regulatory, then he has to go to the regulatory through a proper filing, like an IND or an additional subsequent new drug application. That's how it will work.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
All right. Any other questions? Anybody else? There are no more questions in the Q&A part. There are no more raised hands that I can see. I put the link to the final MCQs in the chat box. All of you can copy that and use it. This link will be available for the next 30 minutes. And it is only for those who are registered in advance for this program and those who have logged in on this Zoom. You can use the link to answer as many times as you want. As soon as you submit, you will get a reply saying which of your questions are right, which of your questions are wrong, and in case your question is wrong, which is the right question. So you can use that information to upgrade your knowledge and then retake the MCQ. But please note that within the next 30 minutes, you must get at least 75% correct answers to be eligible to get the certificate. In the meantime, I should also thank all the panelists, all the speakers for doing such a fantastic job. I think I learned a lot from the interactions, and I saw some very new and updated information that will improve my knowledge as well. Like many of you, I'm also a member of ethics committee, and I think that I will be able to do a better job because I participated in this program.
Thank you, Dr. Purvish. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for inviting us.
Dr. Vora, are you logged in? Dr. Vora is the member secretary of the ethics committee of Mahatma Gandhi Medical College Hospital. Anusha, I'm unmuting you.
Yes,
so
sir. Yes, sir.
Please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Any comments that you can have, we are very much appreciated.
Yes, sir. So all the sessions are very insightful and very informative. So thank you. But sir, we like to have a kind of PDF format. If we could have of all the sessions, it will be a very beneficial for all of us.
We are going to do better than that. We are going to put the recording on the YouTube channel so that everybody can access it.
Okay, thank you, sir.
All those who participated in the workshop will be given the access to that recording on the YouTube.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. There is one more question. I'll just open that. Dr. Sumant has said, please send post-webinar question in email. You are not able to see in chat box. Okay, Dr. Sumant, we will send by email to you. You can type your email address in the question so that I have immediate access to your email. I got your email, Dr. Sumant. I'm copying it and sending you on the by email.
So we have Dr. Santosh's hand raised.
Yeah. Dr. Santosh, I'm asking you to unmute so you can ask the question. Dr. Santosh, can you unmute yourself if you want to ask a question? Dr. Santosh has taken down his hand. I don't know whether his question was answered. If there are no more questions, then I thank everybody. It is 13 minutes past 6 p.m. We will wait till 45 minutes past 6 p.m. for you to complete the MCQ, final MCQs. Exactly at 45 minutes past 6 p.m., we will stop accepting further responses. Finally, once more, I thank all the faculty members for doing a great job and for all the participants for being active and asking all the questions. I can now request the faculty to sign off. And 1 minute later, I can ask Kavina Creations to stop the meeting here.